Usually people associate financial crisis with recent crises like that subprime crisis in the United States or the Eurozone crisis. But from the map, we see that in terms of the frequency and the number over the last 50 or 60 years, Africa has become the epicenter of financial instability with the largest number of financial crises.
Welcome to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. I'm Adam Dixon. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Dariusz Wójcik, who is Professor of Financial Geography at the National University of Singapore. Prior to that, he was a professor at the University of Oxford. Today, we are here to discuss the new Atlas of Finance. Darius, welcome to the New Enlightenment.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Adam.
So, Darius, or I'm just going to say Derek because I know you personally, and that's what friends and family call you, is Derek. You have this Atlas of Finance, but you're a financial geographer. And some listeners are going to say, okay, well, I know what financial economics is, or I think I know what financial economics is. What is financial geography? Does that just mean you do maps and color, right? So geographers always have that kind of label thrown at them. Is it just about maps? What is financial geography so that our listeners can understand that as a subdiscipline within geography or within the broader social sciences?
Yes. So financial geography is interested in what my t-shirt says, finance and space, finance and things geographical, like places, locations, and scale. And this is, by the way, the name of the journal that I'm editing, which was launched last year. So financial geography is about the relationships between finance and space, things geographical. And these relationships work in both directions. Finance influences space and space influences finance. So for example, when you think about the geography, the map of poverty and inequality, in any country like the UK or the US, this map of poverty, this geography of poverty influences credit ratings of people, their ability to get loans. But at the same time, people's ability to get loans, influenced by credit ratings, shapes the map of poverty and inequality, because the more difficult your access to credit, the more difficult it is to get out of the poverty trap. So it's an example of this two-way relationship on how space influences finance and vice versa. And it's actually one of the maps in the Atlas of Finance which shows credit ratings in the US by county to illustrate this relationship.
So tell me though, just to be clear, when people see finance and space, I'm imagining some people thinking, is this about financing Elon Musk's rocket ships to put people on the moon? No, what you're saying is space means it's shorthand for geography. It's shorthand for the places and the space around us that we live and what happens economically, politically, socially, and culturally across space, just to put that out there. What are, though, the difference then between, let's say, financial geography and economic geography, or those that look at these particular issues and topics? And again, this happens in economics. You see people in sociology, political science that are also interested in the geography of different topics of political economy, so poverty, finance, and so on.
So financial geography is distinctive, different from other social sciences studying finance, and particularly different from financial economics for several reasons. One is that as geography, financial geography is most interested in questions related to where, to the places, the locations, the scales. As such, financial geography also relies much more on mixed methods, so both qualitative and quantitative methods. Financial economics, for example, is based almost exclusively on quantitative methods, often very sophisticated equations, advanced mathematics. Financial geography is also much more diverse than financial economics, and I mean it literally. So did you know, for example, that if you look at all Nobel Prize winners, Nobel Memorial Prize for economic sciences. If you look at all the winners over the decades and you select those who were awarded for contributions to financial economics, you find 19 people, and all 19 are white males who got their PhDs in the United States and worked in the US at the time of the award. So there is very little diversity. Probably financial economics could be the most US and most male-dominated of all branches of knowledge. And when you look at financial geography, it's much more diverse in terms of gender, in terms of geography. For example, if you look at who publishes and who runs the journal Finance and Space that I edit. So we are proud of this distinctiveness and difference of financial geography and want to cultivate it.
So you mentioned quantitative versus qualitative methods, and just so listeners understand, so quantitative methods, crunching numbers and running regressions on effectively financial data or some other economic statistics. So financial geography, some people in the field do that kind of work. But what are the qualitative methods, and can you give us a sense of how that would feed into the creation of an atlas, right? So you can, when you think of maps and doing an atlas, most of it's something that's quantified. But what are the qualitative methods, and what does that actually mean? And how does that help us understand the practices of finance in the broadest sense?
Yes. So to me personally, this culture of mixed methods with qualitative, quantitative is very important. And I think it's very important for geography in general and financial geography in particular. So a big example of that is data that comes from interviews or close dialogue with finance practitioners, with financial policymakers, with consumers of financial products. Let me give you an example from the Atlas again. So one of the maps demonstrates the impacts of Brexit on financial centers in Europe. And we use a lot of data which shows that European finance is still extremely concentrated in London. Yeah, so we show a map based on data which illustrates that European finance is still extremely concentrated in London. But then the question comes, why? And how is it possible? And this is where we rely on dozens of interviews we have conducted with insiders, financial insiders around Europe in different financial centers, who tell us why London remains and reigns supreme in European finance. So, for example, one interview partner in Germany tells us that the advantage of London is that it is the center of trading euro as a currency, even though it's outside of the euro zone. Another person tells us that the advantage of London is that it's really absolutely the dominant financial center of the United Kingdom, whereas in Germany, there are several cities, apart from Frankfurt, even in Munich and Berlin, that are significant financial centers. So to conduct financial transactions, in the UK, London is the only place where you need to be, really. And in Germany, you have to travel around. So this is an example how a qualitative research, conversations with people, but also reading policy documents and media reports helps you understand the reasons why the map looks the way it does.
I'm curious, and I want to push you a bit further on that, because you could tell that story simply using quantitative methods, and you just look at the, level of trading, the flows, right? So you can crunch that number and you can show that London is the most dominant, continues to be, and you could probably run a regression that looks at different variables from tax policy to labor market conditions to number of foreign banks to any number of variables that might prove or explain why London continues to dominate. What though, and I understand someone from, in the financial services sector in Frankfurt can say, well, this is why London is the case. And then you can take that. But what is the nuance that you get from a conversation with somebody that tells you that? What, instead of just having them say, this is why, what is it that nuance? Because just want to push you a bit. Why is it that doing that kind of close dialogue or having that conversation, what does that benefit in terms of our knowledge and understanding of finance and the practices of finance in different places?
Yes. So I think the main thing that interviews and qualitative research helps with is to make sense of the patterns you identify with data. And then you can obviously still quantitatively, using statistics, econometrics, you can examine correlations, relationships between different patterns of data. And you can even push, if you're a really good statistician, to try to identify causality, what actually drives these patterns. But that becomes quickly extremely difficult in using quantitative research. Where qualitative research picks up is to help first identify potential factors that shape these maps and these distributions and patterns. And second, identify the mechanisms. What chain of links actually can lead to a particular outcome. So in the end, also qualitative research helps to come up with new theories, with new explanations, helps to understand the mechanisms through which these explanations work. With pure quantitative data, it would be extremely difficult. Having said that, of course, we cannot trust qualitative data at the face value. And this is again why qualitative methods have to be very robust as well. So for the Atlas as a whole, it's been accompanied by about 300 interviews all over the world, because we wanted to get perspectives from different places. So when you get perspective from different places, you can contrast and compare them, and you can get a fuller picture of the situation. So as I said, it's also a matter of perspectives and what kind of stories people in different places have, and they can be very, very surprising. They can change the whole direction of research. For example, when we were doing interviews in 2018, 2019, and also online during the pandemic, one of our objectives was to examine the impact of the global financial crisis of 2007, 2008 on the global financial landscape. And we had a lot of data on it, examining exactly this kind of research question. But most of our interview partners thought very little about the impacts of the crisis, the global financial crisis. Everyone wanted to talk about fintech, financial technology, potentially changing global finance. And this way, you realize that actually even the question and the data you're looking for may be less relevant than you think. Because if 100 people corroborate the same kind of interest and story, this means something and cannot be ignored by a researcher.
You mentioned Nobel Prize winners in economics, and I think it's important to recall the Nobel Prize winning speech of F.A. Hayek, who questioned the kind of scientism, if you like, the positivism, the direction of travel that economics was going in, the mathematicization of it, reminding the audience of his speech that, don't be so sure effectively of the outcomes of this. But he was pushing back because he questioned that kind of certainty, if you like, that the mathematicization of economics was meant to provide. And I think that's not to say quantitative methods aren't super powerful and super interesting. I mean, I've got time for those that do that, and I think it's very useful. It's when it becomes the only method, the only legitimate way of doing social science, I think that's when it becomes a problem. But to be fair, that means that those that do qualitative research should also be careful not to draw too many conclusions from a handful of interviews, or ensure that they're triangulating across different types of data, and just being upfront that, it's the nuance, it's the flavor that you get from a conversation that you can't, and being honest about that. But it's that mixed method approach. And likewise, on doing qualitative methods, are those that I think of trying to push too hard to make qualitative methods overly kind of methodological, if that makes sense, and that it's too constraining. Maybe this is my own personal predilections, where I don't feel like I'm a real social scientist because I kind of always question some of the way we frame methodology. But tell us more about the Atlas of Finance, where in it you say it's an example of FinViz. And so how did this atlas come to life, and what specifically does it add to knowledge and our understanding of finance? Or was it simply meant for a popular audience? You know, it's when you look at it, it's a great coffee table book. I mean, so I don't want to kind of say coffee table book in a derogatory sense. You know, I mean, there's great coffee table books, right, with art books and the like, and you know, people do like pictures. What was the motivation, right? So was this about kind of translating the social science work, the academic work, to a popular audience, or is the atlas itself a vehicle for driving a particular intellectual or scientific agenda?
So let me start by picking up your point about methods and balance in the use of research methods, because there's something to add here. We have quantitative methods, we have qualitative methods, and this is everything that people talk about. So there are qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and this is the end of the distinction that people make. But I would say that visualization, including mapping, but also drawing research in various ways, painting it, is yet another important method of doing research and presenting research. And this is why I consider Atlas of Finance an example of financial visualization. We also call it FinViz. So to give you an exact answer about the origins of this idea, FinViz is a term that my co-author on the Atlas, designer Oliver Uberti, came up with, and then he allowed me to use it. Now we also use it in the Finance and Space journal for a whole section presenting financial visualization. So what is financial visualization is about mapping, drawing, even taking pictures of things financial. It could be graffiti that is a commentary on financial issues. I saw a fantastic graffiti in Ljubljana a couple of years ago, which said, in the 90s we talked about freedom, now we only talk about money. And there was a drawing related to that. I could relate to that because I come from Poland. It was similar in Poland. So it's a very philosophical kind of reflexive statement, which could constitute a piece of research in its own right. And I think these visual methods, for which we have great technologies now, have been neglected in social sciences in general. And it's a shame because there is so much more data that can be mapped and visualized, and there are better software packages to do the visualization. And visuals and maps are a place where the qualitative meets the quantitative in a fantastic way, because with a visual you tell a story. You don't just represent data. You actually represent data in order to tell a story, and to decide on a story, you have to do a lot of qualitative research. And this leads me to the Atlas and answering the second part of your question about what the Atlas was for and how it came about. So I've always envisaged it as a piece of research and based on research. And I first got the idea over a decade ago, but then I realized that to create an atlas, you need a professional cartographer, a professional designer, in addition to other authors. And design cartography cost a lot of money. So then I was lucky to be awarded the European Research Council grant of €2 million, which gave me resources to hire a cartographer, a designer. I also worked with, at some point, 8 postdoctoral researchers who all became co-authors of the Atlas. And imagine, just to illustrate the amount of research that goes into an Atlas like that, these 10 co-authors plus me would not have been enough to create an Atlas over 5 years. We still needed the work of about 200 interns, so Oxford University students who worked for a week at a time to search for data, to review literatures, to find an angle to different stories, because it's not about doing things like, well, let's map the value of insurance premia by country around the world. You can find websites, World Bank, IMF, International Monetary Fund, other organizations that map in a basic way, basic financial data by country. So our objective was to tell research-based stories which tell people something they didn't know, and that can be used to teach about finance to social scientists, natural geographers, economists, anyone, really. So yeah, we're talking about an enormous amount of work. I estimate it to be between 12 and 15,000 hours of work. About half of it on data collection, and and the rest on literature reviews and design and drafting and editing.
So tell us a bit on what's in the atlas, right? So of course we want to encourage listeners to go and buy the atlas. It is really quite spectacular to see, and it is one of those colorful things where you can imagine even young people looking through it and wondering. And I'm just thinking of me as like a curious 10-year-old who kind of liked atlases and things like that, but looking through books like that, that's why it's so kind of interesting. What's in it? What are the stories that you tell? And I know there's a page or two on Adam Smith, so I want to ask you about that in a minute here. But what broadly are the constituent parts of the atlas?
Yeah, so for the amount of work and research that I mentioned, you would hope that the atlas achieves something. And for me, there are 5 groups of contributions. One is atlas showing patterns, revealing patterns of finance that people have not seen before. To give you an example, we have a map of the history of financial crises going back to 1600. Nearly 1,000 significant financial crises of different kinds. And usually people associate financial crises with recent crises like that subprime crisis in the United States or the Eurozone crisis. But from the map, we see that in terms of the frequency and the number over the last 50 or 60 years, Africa has become the epicenter of financial instability. With the largest number of financial crises. They're not so big yet to shake the global economy, but nevertheless, this is where most crises happen most often. In contrast, Asia seems to be a relatively stable continent financially. So you see patterns that you wouldn't see without putting data properly on the map. Another contribution is to basically answer one of the most basic questions about finance, which few people have dared to answer clearly, which is, where does finance actually come from? Where exactly and when exactly does it come from? So our answer, based on research in archaeology and history and anthropology, is that the oldest financial artifacts come from Sumeria, Mesopotamia.
And by finance, just in terms of putting a definition on it, right? So people are thinking, what is finance? Is that money generally? No. Is it the act of lending for a return over time? Is that the basic definition of finance? So what is define finance? And then what is the object, the unit of analysis? And then how do you take that back to finance origins?
I'm glad you asked this question because it doesn't get asked enough. What is finance? And it's much more than money. It actually makes me think about one of the most popular podcast speakers these days. Just open YouTube or anything, and you see Yuval Noah Harari talking about his new book, Nexus. And in this book, he also talks about money as the biggest story of all times. Bigger than religion, based on trust, basically a story that keeps Harari talks about money as the biggest story of all times that keeps the global economy and to some extent society together. But I actually disagree with Harari because I think it's a narrow definition of what money is. And I think that finance is about much more than a story. So my definition of finance, which is explained in the Atlas as well, is that finance is about relationships among people, human relationships, and between people and environment and nature. So human-environment relationships. And these relationships, well, are everywhere, but they become finance when they mediate it with money. So when money comes in between, these relationships become part of finance. So it's a very broad definition of finance, I admit. But in my view, it's a clear definition and a necessary definition, very geographical definition. Because you can imagine an economy without finance. You can imagine it. It existed before. There were civilizations like Aboriginal Australians who didn't use finance and they functioned. They had trade, they had consumption, they had production. You could say they were all limited from contemporary perspective, but that civilization, that economy functioned for over 50,000 years until it met a civilization that actually used finance, of course.
Yeah.
So this is my definition, and I think it's very important to have a definition. Let me just add that it actually makes me think about Adam Smith as well, because when you take The Wealth of Nations, he has his great work. Obviously, Smith makes plenty of contributions to understanding finance, but he doesn't define finance. Neither do Karl Marx or John Maynard Keynes after Smith. So all these great thinkers, they really avoid trying to define finance. They talk about things financial, about capital, a lot in fantastic ways, but they don't define finance. And I find this problematic. Because if we call things financial, well, we need to understand what finance is in the first place.
I want a bit more clarification, I think, because I think listeners are still wondering, how is that different from money, right? So you mentioned money, and money is like the tool that connects these relationships. What specific, though, is finance? It's instead of the mediation between human to human relationships or human to nature relationships. Unpack that a bit more so that we understand better why the likes of Marx or Keynes or Smith fail to provide a definition of finance, or why today Yuval Harari is narrow in his definition when he just says money as, dollars and cents or seashells. What specific? I'm still trying to get out of you. What is finance? What is that?
Yes. So yeah, money is fortunately easy to define. Yeah. Money is obviously the center of this definition of finance that I gave you. So we need to define money first. Money has a good definition, quite widely accepted. It's anything that serves as a medium of exchange, a unit of account in which we express value of things and store of value. And how well something serves as money depends on how reliably it can perform all these three functions. And US dollar, today is the most influential money. You could say the best money because it performs all these three functions better than anything else. I mean, Bitcoin
doesn't. Yeah.
You could definitely measure the value of things in them because you can get an exchange rate between Bitcoin and anything else. Is you can get an exchange rate between Bitcoin and any other currency or anything else. But good luck to people who want to store value in Bitcoin and hope for a stable value of Bitcoin or most other cryptocurrencies in the future. So that's money. But then, so we can put money aside. That definition is easy. But for me, finance is a system. Money is a tool. Money is an instrument. And finance is a system, is a social and technical system that uses money. And it's made of relationships, as I said, because relationships is actually, this is what life and the world is made of. We exist through these and function, most of all, through these relationships. And these relationships become financial or financialized when money is involved. And money changes these relationships. So, for example, without money, the work we do could be just, work, could be doing something in exchange of gifts for people we we feel obliged to all lie. And this is how work functioned. Before, with the use of money, work became labor, paid labor, whereby you expect work to be rewarded with money. A lot of work still happens without money. A lot of work we do every day is in our households. We iron for ourselves and for each other. We cook. We look after children and families without expecting money. So this is work. It becomes labor, part of the financial economy, when we care about payment for these things. Similarly, money affects relationships with the environment, with nature. So there are trees outside of my window, and I can admire them. They look beautiful. They
Tropical
can make me
trees there in
feel
Singapore.
calmer. Yeah, it's in Singapore, so it's lush green. So in this sense, the environment I look at isn't part of finance, doesn't do anything financial in monetary terms to me. But when we start analyzing the contribution of these trees to the production of oxygen and assimilation of carbon dioxide, and then we express this, what people would call ecosystem service of these trees in monetary terms, then my thinking, my relationship to these woods, to these trees becomes part of finance. And this happens at an individual level and at a social level. So
what is the difference then between the economic and the financial, right? So I think
yes.
that's an important distinction to make, because some would say, well, okay, if you put a value on a forest and you trade a credit for it, okay, that's financial, but it's an economic relationship as well. So what is the difference between economics or the economic and the financial?
So I would say that everything financial is economic. Finance is part of the economy, but not everything economic is financial. Economy is about production, consumption, distribution. All of these processes can take place without the use of money, without the medium of money. And historically, they did. I understand these days it is difficult for us to imagine anything economic without finance, because the economy, and difficult to imagine anything economic not being financial, because the economy has become financialized, and so has society, and to some extent the environment. But it's important, and this definition of finance reminds us that economy and many functions of the economy, many areas of the economy are possible without finance. And in fact, I would say this distinction between finance and economy helps us realize that maybe to make finance better, to reform finance, we actually need less of it in some areas of the economy, not more of it. We cannot just keep solving economic problems by throwing finance at it.
Yeah. No, I think it's, people take for granted that, here in Britain, only 250, 200, 300 years ago, many people weren't in wage labor. There was still a feudal system across much of Europe, in the early 18th century and in the 17th century. Very few people, under a feudal system, it's not a wage labor system. I mean, there were parts of the economy and cities and towns where people may have had some kind of a wage, but for the vast majority of people, there wasn't a wage. They were, servants of the land, if you like, for the great lord, and not to mention enslaved people in different parts of the world. And so this idea that we take for granted that what we think of as how an economy runs today on wage labor is fairly recent phenomenon, the last sort of 300 years. And even you mentioned so you're from Poland, and you're old enough to remember what life was like in socialist Poland before the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. That was a different type of economy. There was still an economy that you could measure, but was there finance in Poland? I mean, tell us just, I mean, if you don't mind giving a bit of a personal kind of relation here on how that was, so people can understand. So again, because for most people, they just, young people in particular, they don't know what life was like even a generation or two ago, particularly if you grew up in Western Europe or North America or Australia or New Zealand or Japan, where you had kind of liberal economies. What was life like in, 1980s Poland before the collapse of the Iron Curtain? What was that like? Well, what was finance there? Just so we can kind of put this in perspective.
So let me start where you started. Absolutely. Adding finance, using money in the economy has many liberating aspects to it. And obviously, Adam Smith wrote about that as well. And it's worth remembering, when the serf in the relationship with the feudal lord has no choice but has to deliver a given amount of wheat or barley, or honey, they have no choice what to do. For the rest of the year, they just have to plow a wheat field or whatever else the Lord asks for. When, even in feudalism, when serf is supposed to pay money to the Lord, suddenly there is choice about what to grow, what to do, how to get hold of that money. So even going back to feudalism and then transition to capitalism, money shows this its face, which has to do with freedom. And this leads me to the second part of your question about money in socialist countries. So we know that when you read the Communist Manifesto by Engels and Marx, money is the enemy. And there is a vision and Engels and Marx in the manifesto paint a vision of society without money, without banks. And this is what socialist governments in Eastern Europe tried to implement. Motto was to build cities without banks and churches. These were the enemies. And it's interesting how society dealt with it, because money was not supposed to be used in many relationships, but it still kind of penetrated a lot of relationships in often negative ways. So, for example, few people who didn't live in a socialist country would remember that bribery is rife, is everywhere. The market is not allowed to work in terms of the supply and demand for certain services or work. So it becomes, these financial flows, monetary flows, become part of a black market, including bribes, not only for services, but also bribes through which people pay to doctors to make sure the loved ones get good treatment or any treatment in a hospital, because they would know that doctors are underpaid anyway, and can get such bribes for better services. So we also see how money, though formally not being allowed in some areas of the system, still penetrates the system. And we know that these experiments to build societies in modern history, to build societies that abolish in many ways, they largely or totally, in international context, failed people they were supposed to serve.
And many young people at elite universities have forgotten that, or think a different world is possible. The historical record says otherwise. You mentioned that Adam Smith was a financial geographer. Smith scholars might kind of raise an eyebrow and say, oh, what does that mean? How is Smith a financial geographer? And I say that because he's looking at you, wondering himself.
So absolutely. Looking at the painting behind you, I feel the responsibility when I answer this question. Yes. So we talk about Adam Smith in the Atlas. He features on the cover of the Atlas, not just for the sake of an illustration. We did a lot of research on the works of Adam Smith, and we were surprised. I say we. I published a paper on this with my colleague Stefanos Ioannou, and we discovered that Adam Smith was in many ways an economic geographer and a financial geographer. How? Obviously, we're talking about 18th century. In the 18th century, the leading financial center of Europe and probably the world was Amsterdam. And this was well known to Adam Smith, who actually, one of his key informants that also influenced his thinking about the economy and finance in particular was Henry Hope, the leading banker of Amsterdam and the founder of what you could call the Goldman Sachs of the 18th century, a Hope Bank in Amsterdam. It was an investment bank. It was a hugely influential institution. And Adam Smith and Henry Hope exchanged letters on a regular basis. And so this was, if you like, the qualitative research of Adam Smith on financial geography. And in The Wealth of Nations, there is a section which talks about the reasons why Amsterdam and not in other place in Europe was the leading financial center. So what was fascinating about Amsterdam being the leading financial center of Europe in the 18th century was that it wasn't the biggest city in Europe. There were bigger cities like Paris. It was obviously the center of an influential economy, the United Provinces, you could call, an imperial power, a colonial power, obviously, internationally. And the reasons that Adam Smith focuses on are first trustworthy institutions of Amsterdam with Bank of Amsterdam, which was a kind of a clearing institution and a central bank, but not officially in Amsterdam. So trust. So Smith stresses the significance of trust for financial transactions, but also location and the role of Amsterdam in intermediating trade. So in the 18th century, there was a big trade on the Baltic Sea with countries like Russia and Poland exporting wood, exporting grains to the rest of Europe. Countries in Southern Europe like Portugal and Spain, then still powerful, were importing big quantities of grains and exporting commodities like wine or olive oil. And the question is, how would then olive oil and wine get from the Iberian Peninsula to the Baltic and in exchange for grains or wood? And here is where Amsterdam comes in with its role of financing this trade, ensuring this trade, and providing legal services to draw contracts between the trading parties. So Amsterdam was a place of transshipment for these goods between the Baltic and the rest of the world, or the Mediterranean and the Baltic. But also was the place where financial and business and legal services were provided for this trade. This is financial geography writ large in the financial history of Europe, described by Adam Smith. So this is a section of The Wealth of Nations, mostly forgotten now.
No, this I think is a fascinating kind of history of Smith, and I think it also emphasizes his, they weren't able to go and do the type of qualitative field work that researchers nowadays can do, assuming there's the finances to do it, the support to do it, and things can be done virtually now. But what I always emphasize to people that visit Panmure House, that he had 3,000 titles in his possession. Complete works of Voltaire, Shakespeare. So it was art, it was literature, it was, obviously philosophy, ancient philosophy, other contemporaries of his, David Hume, Lord Kames, Adam Ferguson. But he also had travel writings that he was reading. He was reading about James Cook's voyages to the South Pacific. So they were kind of very interested in the world and understanding it. And I think it was a hallmark of the Scottish Enlightenment and their empiricism. They weren't kind of asking questions about what is society and what society should be, as he did in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, or what is an economy and what the economy should be, as he did in The Wealth of Nations, as a kind of 1,000-page treatise on why mercantilism is bad. But he was reading about what was happening in the colonies in America. He was reading about Chinese civilization and Indian civilization. He was interested in these. And in as much as there was interaction, I mean, he did travel to France and Switzerland with the Duke of Buccleuch for a few years and met figures of the French Enlightenment. But even here in Edinburgh, you mentioned his correspondence with Hope in Amsterdam. We also have to remember that many of Smith's great friends, such as James Hutton, who's notionally the father of geology, he did his PhD in medicine at Leiden University, which is in the Netherlands, right? So there was a deep kind of interaction, and also legal scholars were going to Leiden. Scottish legal scholars were studying in Leiden because of the emphasis on Roman law and its relationship with Scottish law. So there was in as much as we think of, there wasn't a republic of letters, as some call it today. There was interactions, and so it was possible to understand, at least approximate the real world lived experience. And of course, Smith had economic texts that he was looking at. I mean, he's got books. We've some examples of the finances of France, and he was looking at economic statistics of agricultural production. And so they were assembling. And Smith, this was what was so great about Smith, was he was a very synthetic thinker, being able to synthesize and bring together many, many kind of different aspects. And so I think, you calling him a financial geographer, I think is, there's a lot we can put and say that Smith contributed to, but, it makes sense to me because he, again, speaking about the why Amsterdam, and that was always what Smith was wondering, is it's we have to remember that the wealth of nations is the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. So it's the first, why is, an economy the way it is, or what I should say, and then why is it that way? So what is Amsterdam in the place of European finance at the time, or global finance, as you could say then, and why is that the case? I want to finish our discussion on what surprised you in the production of this atlas. And as a follow-on question to that, we live in a world that is increasingly fractured. Illiberalism is rife, not simply as explicit political economy in places like Hungary, but with the rise of China, or more kind of, let's say, quasi-authoritarian states where democracy is only notional if it exists at all. We see increasing protectionist efforts on the part of Western governments through investment screening regulations, a bit more barriers to foreign direct investment, or as some would say, rise in state capitalism or neo-mercantilism. What, in that respect, is the future of finance, and how does the Atlas speak to that? So that's a big multi-part question, but on the one hand, what surprised you? And if you can relate that surprise potentially to the future in a fractured world.
Thank you. First of all, you really whetted my appetite for exploring the Panmure House archives. At some point, I hope I'll be able to do that. I would love to see whether there are any maps in the archive as well.
There's books we have that have really cool maps, let's just say. Yes, absolutely. And Smith's collection, I mean, we're rebuilding his library based on, we know books that we're buying editions, not that he would have personally owned, but editions that he would have had. We don't have that much shelf space and budget to buy all 3,000 titles, but we're getting there. But we have some examples that show maps and kind of looking at maps, and we can fold them out. It's really cool. So yes, you'll have to come.
Fantastic. I will. It will be part of my research for the second edition of the Atlas of Finance, hopefully, to extend this story on great thinkers and finance in space. So to answer a question about surprises that I came across working on the Atlas, I think the biggest thing for me with the Atlas was the learning experience. That was amazing, working with political scientists, economic sociologists, data scientists, cartographers, designers, because you really almost physically feel you're using parts of your brain that you didn't use before. So it's really the process which was fantastic. So you mentioned Adam Smith having a very synthetic mind, based on a lot of analysis, of course, and a lot of research. Creating an atlas is a bit similar. You actually, and this is my experience, to do it responsibly, you have to know at least as much as for writing academic papers. And why? Why? Because in an atlas, in a map, in a visual. So in an atlas, in a map, in a visual, in order to map, to put a dot somewhere, to put a line somewhere, to decide on the color, you have to commit. You cannot draw things like there appears to be a relationship between, you cannot do wishy-washy things when a phenomenon. You have to commit to a color, to a shape, to a place on the map. I'll give you an example of that. So this was researching history of coinage. Basically, we wanted to create a kind of a timeline map which shows where societies in different parts of the world first started to create coins and use coins. And according to established knowledge, the oldest coinage comes from today's Western Turkey. This was in the late 7th century BCE. Close to Greek colonies in Western Turkey, like Ephesus. And these coins were made of silver and gold. People didn't know back then how to separate silver from gold. So there are beautiful coins. You can see them in museums like British Museum, Ashmolean in Oxford, other parts of the world. But then suddenly in 2021, this map, this spread about coinage was almost finished. After hundreds of hours of work and hundreds of hours of research, one of my co-authors emails me with panic, Darek, did you see there is a new paper, an article in Nature by Chinese scholars documenting that the oldest coins in the world were found in China, that the oldest coinage comes from China, not from Asia Minor, not from Western civilization. So obviously a very important paper. One of these papers, in the debate about who invented what first, in history. And my first reaction was a bit of panic because I thought that, hundreds of hours of work are wasted. We now have to change the whole layout because we need to put China in front of Turkey as the first place where coins were invented. But then the best advice is always to do research. So I basically read the Nature paper, and it turns out, and obviously there is no need to question, it's a Nature paper, it's well reviewed, it's robust methodology, and it turned out that what the paper documented was that there was a building which was probably could have been a mint that is older than the oldest coins from Western Turkey, but nobody has found any surviving coins there. So there is a building which was probably a mint, but they could have been producing agricultural tools like knives and other things made of bronze as well, because the oldest Chinese coinage was made of bronze. And this transition from minting and making agricultural tools to making money was a fluid transition, which is difficult to pinpoint. So basically, my reaction was that, well, the oldest coinage should be defined by the oldest surviving coins. Therefore, there is no need to change the visual because the oldest coins still come from what we thought before. Obviously, we added discussion on this, and there's new evidence on old mints in China in the atlas, but we didn't have to change everything. So so you find surprises like this both in the history and geography of finance. And let me I can give you more examples, but then let me answer the second question about contemporary global finance and the and geopolitics. Of course, there are growing tensions in geopolitics, and we try to do justice to financial implications of these tensions. I would even say that we're dealing with geopolitical tensions, geoeconomic tensions, but also geofinancial tensions. And let me explain again with definition. So geopolitics is global power politics. Geoeconomics could be called power politics by economic means rather than military means. So trade sanctions, for example. But then you could also think of geofinance, which is power politics by financial means. Financial means like global currency, dominant currency, or financial sanctions. And this is what we have maps on in the Atlas of Finance. So one thing we map is how extremely durable the power of the US dollar is. When we look at the share of US dollar in the global economy over the last 30 years at least, it's hardly changed. Euro was significant at some point, became quite insignificant, as significant as the German currency Deutschmark on its own was before euro was created. So this tells you about the weakness of euro. And the Chinese currency is still very insignificant compared to the US currency. And another thing that we map is the proliferation of financial sanctions. Of course, now almost everyone has heard of them because of the Russian invasion on Ukraine and sanctions on Russia from US, EU, and beyond. What we show in the Atlas is actually, what is interesting is that, first of all, is how these sanctions have multiplied since the Second World War. They hardly existed after the Second World War, and now financial sanctions became the sanctions of choice for various reasons, partly to do with the perceived effectiveness, because if you shut off an economy from access to US dollar and financial intermediaries using US dollars, you can already achieve quite a lot. It's difficult to survive in the global economy without access to US dollar and its circulation. But we have to remember that financial sanctions are a very powerful but double-edged sword. So I'm sitting now in Singapore where I work, in Southeast Asia, which I believe is also an important pivot, geographical pivot of modern history and probably future history. And the way that many countries in this region, Southeast Asia, look at financial sanctions on Russia is that first, it demonstrates to them the significance of the US dollar, but then they are thinking about, well, if they commit anything that makes US or EU impose sanctions on them, how do they become less vulnerable to the prospect of such sanctions? And the answer is obviously diversify, at least partly, away from the dependence on the US dollar. So at the same time, it's an encouragement to use renminbi, possibly euro, and other currencies to make sure that the economy can function, even if something happens that would bring financial sanctions on these countries. So there are trade-offs in these processes. You cannot use these financial weapons. You cannot use these financial weapons of mass destructions, of however you call them, without negative effects, even on governments and organizations that actually impose them.
Dariusz Wójcik, a future that is perhaps uncertain, but the Atlas of Finance will give us a long historical view of where finance has come and potentially where finance is going, with a picture of Adam Smith, very similar to the one behind me. Thank you, Dariusz, for being on the New Enlightenment podcast, and I hope to see you soon in person.
Me too. Thank you very much.
You have been listening to the New Enlightenment podcast from Adam Smith's Panmure House. If you found this interesting, please consider subscribing and sharing. If you would like to learn more about Panmure House, please go to our website, panmurehouse.org. Thanks for listening, and until next time.